So we would like to, or Agnieszka and me, we would like to give a presentation about interpersonal distance preferences, touch behaviors, and the country level COVID-19 early transmission rate. And I'm gonna talk about the starting points of this research, and it's a large cross-cultural research we are talking about. And then Agnieszka is going to take over and talk about the specific COVID effects. But let me first try to set the base for you all. So the starting point is the following. In 2016, we did a large cross-cultural survey. Approximately 14,000 individuals, actually a little bit more were surveyed on a lot of variables, because when you do this kind of large scale research, then you start collecting a lot of variables, and some of those variables were related to touch behavior. Altogether, we managed to include 45 countries, and when I say we, then actually this is Agnieszka who did it. So it's, credits totally go to her. The touch variables we collected was the touch frequency, and the other one, maybe not absolutely related to touch, was interpersonal distance behavior. So how is your preferred interpersonal distance to another individual while just speaking or interacting with him or her? But let's start with the touch frequency. That's the paper we published last year on this matter. And what we have done was very simple, because, as I said, it's a large cross-cultural survey. So the questions, each single question needs to be very simple and understandable in a lot of cultures. So we just asked all of our participants, please cross if you have performed this type of touch in the last week. So we asked them, did you kiss your partner? Did you embrace or hug your partner? Or did you stroke your partner? And not only your partner, but also your female friend, your male friend, and your youngest child. And of course, we also asked whether the participants met their partner, youngest child, female friend, male friend, and whether they actually have a youngest child and so on. And we know the age of the children and of the partners. So very simple, just have you done this kind of behavior? And this is the results. Over all of our 14,000 participants, we see that there's a variance of touch behavior. And this variance relates to the touch type and to the individual performing the touch. What we first see is the touch to a partner. Here, the arrows, there is more prevalent than touch to a male or a female friend. That's probably common knowledge. Yeah, it's just nice to replicate and to see this. What you also can see is this interaction effect, namely that some types of touch behavior, like hugging and embracing, are not as intimate as other kinds like kissing and stroking are, because those have a larger spread between partner and child on the one hand and female and male friend on the other hand. So I said this was a cross-cultural study, so we should probably make use of the variable of countries, or of the variance of countries we included. And we have done this. And here I would like to first put your attention to the effective touch prevalence. That's just a question, how many % of the individuals in each country have performed at least one of those kinds of touch. And then you see some cross-cultural variances. The darker the color is, the more or the higher frequency we have, and the brighter the color is, the less touch was basically performed. The effective touch degree calculates in which type of touch was performed. So we see there are some differences between countries. Then what we have done next is we tried to relate this to some country variables. And we had a lot of country variables and also interpersonal variables or within-person variables such as sex and age and religiosity and stuff like that. I'm just giving you the brief results here because we would like to come to the COVID section. So in brief, what we found is we have a higher prevalence of touch in those countries which have a higher temperature, a higher average temperature over the year. We have a higher frequency of touch in females. So females touch more than males do, or at least they report more touch than males do. Older individuals report less touch. More religious individuals also report less touch. And countries which are very high on conservatism also report less touch. This was the touch frequency part. And then we had the interpersonal distance part. And both of those variables will also be interesting for the COVID part later. So just stay with me here. The interpersonal distance. We also measured this again with very simple questions. And this is the publication related to it. And I mean, you can see in the list of authors, it's just been a lot of countries. So the very simple question was, how close can you come to an interaction partner to feel comfortable? And again, we asked for a variance of different interaction partners. And here are the results. We asked for the preferred social distance to a stranger, to someone who you know pretty well, but not too well, and to a very close person. And what we replicated is this Hall effect. So the variance, the average, and not variance, the average preferred distance is, of course, much closer for intimate interaction partners than it is for strangers. And what you see again is a large spread between countries. And again, the same thing was done. So we looked what are the variables which moderate this. Let me guide you through this. Men prefer a larger interpersonal distance. In countries where it is very cold, we have a lower interpersonal distance, matches very nicely before mentioned data. Yeah, and this has actually been the starting point. So we had this very nice survey, we have some basic data, and then COVID came, and Agnieszka is going to take over. And Agnieszka, I'm going to press the buttons, so you can talk and I try to press it at the same time.
Hello, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and can you hear my screen? Can you see my screen or that's Ilona's screen?
We can perfectly well hear your screen, but yeah, and now you are in presentation mode. Yes, perfect, and
yes,
it's your screen.
So that's
yes.
perfect. So I think it would be better if I just take over like that. It's easier. So as you saw in the previous slide shown by Ilona, there is a huge variability between the countries in terms of personal distance and touch behaviors. But the basic conclusion is that everybody touches other people. In every country, people touch others. And in every country, people get close to other people in order to touch them. And so when the COVID pandemic came, it was suddenly not a good thing. Despite all the positive consequences of touch and close interpersonal distance and hugging, stroking, even handshaking with strangers, COVID makes touch a bad thing. So the COVID pandemic led to social distancing recommendations imposed by different health organizations, different governments. And overall, we are recommended to get as far from others as possible. So in the context of our results, this is very interesting because as you saw in the previous slide, people actually like being close to others. So we decided to explore whether the cultural level of closeness preferred by people actually relates to the COVID transmission rate. So given the recommendation for physical distancing of between 1 and 2 meters and the actual behaviors of people in the countries, we wanted to see whether the recommended no physical contact between strangers actually led to a lower transmission rate between different individuals. So we explored whether the cultural variance in interpersonal touch frequency and interpersonal distance preferences predicted early COVID spreading rate within the countries that were included in our previous cross-cultural study. So what was our dependent variable and who completed the survey? We already know that we had over 9,000 individuals in our study who inhabited 41 countries. And this time we decided to explore only stranger-oriented questions because the probability of disease transmission between individuals inhabiting the same household was high, like despite all the regulations imposed by governments. So we focused on strangers. Our dependent variable, our main predictor was the touch frequency, and that was the handshake frequency between strangers and the casual touch between strangers. Additionally, we explored the preferred interpersonal distance. So as Ilona mentioned, the preferred comfortable distance in interactions with strangers. The potential confounders of our results were the testing capacity within each country. So that was a number of tests that was conducted per million inhabitants within each country, and also the median age within each of the analyzed regions. These two variables were very important because you cannot really say that the level of COVID is, I don't know, low if you don't perform any tests. Yes, because if you don't test, then you don't see any diseases. And as for the age, people who are very young are likely to pass the disease very likely without serious consequences. So they are rather unlikely to be included in the official statistics. We also explored several other variables that were shown to correlate with COVID transmission rate in other studies, and that was the gross domestic product per capita, population density, Gini index, which is a measure of like wealth distribution within the population, and average monthly temperature. All these factors were shown to affect the transmission rate of COVID in early stages of the pandemic. And now coming to the dependent variable that we selected, that was the cumulative number of cases 20 days after the 100th case in each country was reported. That may sound very complicated, but actually think about that. If we have a country that reports no cases in the beginning, then maybe 2, 3, 4, and suddenly it reaches 100 cases, this means that this country has already entered the exponential growth phase of the pandemic. So we decided to count the number of cases 20 days after this 100 case because of the replication rate of the COVID and because of the average incubation time that is approximately 5 days. So if a country reported a 100th case, for example, on the 30th of March, we would include the 29th of, no, that's, sorry, there's something wrong on our slide. Sorry. So we would include the data from the 20th of April in our statistics. And the variability of this index was actually quite high because in some countries, the number would stay very close to the original 100, whereas in other countries, the numbers would largely exceed 1,000. So what we did, as you may see in this table that summarizes our descriptive statistics, was computing the number of the percentage of females, the median sample, the median age in our sample in each country, and then we also computed the average handshake or casual touch frequency, which would indicate that within this particular country, people are likely to touch strangers. And then, as you may see, that's the column that I am now indicating with my cursor that shows the number of cases 20 days after reporting the 100th case. Sorry, there's something wrong. the casual touch or handshake frequency and the preferred interpersonal distance to a stranger were both significantly related to the number of cases recorded in each country 20 days after the 100th case. And as you may see, the analysis weighted by a number of tests indicated that this relationship was significant despite the testing. So if people in a given country performed less tests, they would be, as you may see, the dot is then smaller, and the larger number of testing is indicated by the larger dot, but still the relationship is significant and positive. So the higher casual touch or handshake frequency in a given country, the higher number of cases 20 days after the 100th case. And the same for preferred interpersonal distance. So the lower preferred interpersonal distance to a stranger, the higher number of contagions in the early stages of the pandemic. This is very interesting because all these results were recorded while controlling for other factors that were also shown to be accountable for the early COVID transmission. And our hierarchical modeling of all the variables that we included in the model showed that the median touch rate and the distance rate were valid predictors of the COVID transmission rate, regardless of all the other cultural level and individual level factors. As for other predictors that were shown to be important in terms of cultural level transmission of the COVID, we replicated the finding that showing that per capita, gross domestic product per capita was an important predictor of the COVID transmission rate, as well as Gini index, so the wealth inequality, which is what is also important here is that regardless of the average temperature, the rate of casual touch and handshake frequency and the preferred interpersonal distance to a stranger were valid predictors of the COVID transmission rate, which is particularly important in terms of cultural differences in casual touch and handshake frequency and preferred interpersonal distance to a stranger, which were shown to be more intense or more prevalent in countries that are warmer. So our study was based on 9,000 participants in 41 countries. So we surveyed the interpersonal distance and touch frequency in a really, really large group of cultures that were different in terms of a number of variables. But we still observed that the touch frequency rate and the interpersonal distance preference were related to the COVID pandemic dynamics in the early stages of this dynamic. So it is then possible that physical distancing to strangers, which is understood as both touching of the strangers and getting close to strangers in a physical way, is an important factor when containing the disease. So it seems that all the recommendations that suggest that you should really get as far from the stranger as possible are correct. This is sad in the context, especially in the context of other presentations that I saw later on in the program, but it really seems that reduced touch and increased distancing is a recommendable way to contain the pandemic, especially when the number of cases is not really huge. So our study additionally shows that a survey that we used may be a valid method for testing individual compliance to the methods, to the regulations, and it also can be a valid way to measure the cultural level compliance with different regulations. Of course, there are certain problems associated with this method. For example, if you're governmentally issued policeman that will come to your household would question whether you comply with the regulations imposed by your government, you would definitely say that yes. So the social desirability may be a bit problematic here, but nevertheless, the validity of the relationship that we observed in our study shows that even questioning people about distancing preferences or their touch behaviors may be useful in terms of observation or further actions related to the COVID pandemic. And our study additionally helps understand and define different constructs that are related to the COVID pandemic in terms of touch behaviors, in terms of interpersonal relationships. So we believe that our data may be helpful for others also when assessing the dynamics of pandemic in the different stages. Our study has also opened certain new questions, which I would be very happy, and Ilona, of course, as well, to discuss with you during the discussion part. But it would be really interesting to explore how the touch frequency and preferred distance change now in the course of the pandemic. Because one thing is that we may know that in the early stages of the pandemic, COVID was transmitted more frequently in countries that like touching and get very close to others. But now it is possible that the countries changed in their preferred interpersonal distance preferences and changed in their touching patterns, especially in the regions that suffered a lot from the pandemic. It is very likely that people got used to touching less or got used to getting as far away from strangers as possible. This is obviously very detrimental for our health, not only the mental health, but also the physical health, because touch and getting close to others is important for different aspects of our lives. But it is very interesting whether this actually changed in the course of the pandemic. So I would really like to thank Ilona for preparing this wonderful presentation and for working with me on this study, and thank all the co-authors who contributed to this research, who collected data in the variety of wonderful regions across the world. And thank you, the wonderful organizers of this conference, for gathering us all here in order to discuss these important issues related to the pandemic.
Thank you to both you, Agnieszka, and Ilona, for not only joining us today, but sharing this wonderful before and after data. I think I assume a lot of it has to do with luck, but it's also about, being at the forefront of the big questions. And I think these, as I said in introducing you, I think that there is something to be said for exploring these individual and cultural differences, and obviously the interplay between those two things, which again could be a theme to discuss throughout the day, and maybe as we bring the session to a close. I think the interplay might be really the crux of it, actually, how these social or cultural norms either override individual preferences, how cultural norms may be more or less flexible compared to individual norms. These are all questions we can talk about. I'm just checking quickly. So far, I don't see any questions, just rave reviews on the chat. This is what happens when you speak to an audience you've already convinced. They thank you for your papers, for your and for your data. But I have a quick question, and maybe you can think about it and answer later. But so we measured interpersonal distance in a slightly more implicit manner. We had people doing an auditory task where they hear the footsteps of somebody approaching, and then they say stop. And again, then we actually did it twice. We once did it to ask them at which point they could touch, to reach out and touch. So more sort of about peripersonal reaching space. And then a second version of the task where they're instructed to say stop when they feel uncomfortable with the distance, which I think aligns very well with the way you've posed that question. So I'd just be curious to know what you think about the comparison between explicit and implicit measures. And then we have to compare our data. Unfortunately, for interpersonal distance, we only have Germany and UK, but maybe we can check to see how those, but theoretically, I'd be curious to hear what you think in terms of how those two different measures match up.
Agnieszka, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Mele, that's super interesting, yeah, what you just say. So I mean, we had our survey question, which is a good explicit measurement, but probably not the most ecological valid. So what you say, or I mean, there are ups and downs. Yeah, it's always a question of priorities, what to do. What you just said with the approaching footsteps is, of course, a very clever, very nice idea. What I would think is that there should be a correlation, of course. So individuals who allow a very close distance in your study should also be those individuals allowing a very close distance in our study. But I would think that no, it would. I have no idea. I think it would be extremely interesting to just compare what's the centimeter differences between the more implicit and the explicit threshold. And then, of course, one could also do the third condition, actually putting two persons next to each other. Exactly. So this is something we are actually trying to do right now. So one of those persons not knowing that she is in a research context, and the other one just going closer and closer to her, and then we will see how the other one moves away eventually. At least this is the daily life experience probably a lot of people share.
No, that's amazing. I mean, that's sort of, I'm doing more and more in virtual reality at the moment. I'm thinking of how we can use something similar to go beyond the auditory domain, because there is something incredibly, I don't know, you're talking about defensive space, which is what will probably come up in Yasmin's talk a little bit more. In that auditory domain, I think if you think about scary movies, it's the sound of somebody approaching, which, you know, gets you.
Exactly, that's what I thought. Mm-hmm. That's what I thought when you described
I wonder if we're driving our effect a little bit almost artificially by going through the auditory domain, whereas yours, I don't know, I was just trying to sort of pick apart where the pros and cons lie, because as you say, there are you know, advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, but we must correlate our data, at least for those two samples. I think our sample sizes are minute compared to yours. Again, I'm so impressed. Congratulations on acquiring this incredibly invaluable data. But we must compare and contrast, see how these measures align. Without further ado, I just want to thank you both. No other questions are popping up, but maybe some will come up in the chat, so do follow on. But thank you to you both, not only for exquisite division of labor, which I always love to see, not only for the study, but your talk as well. Thank you for the great and clear slides.